All right, so this recording is meant to give you a high-level overview of some of the key historical moments in school desegregation and, unfortunately, resegregation. And I'm having you watch this now as you're thinking about the role of public education in the United States, and as you're about to embark on reading Kozel's book, Savage Inequalities, which really exemplifies and highlights some of the effects of the segregation of schools and the ways in which students in highly segregated schools are not being well served by the public education system in the United States at this point. So going back kind of to the very beginning, where court cases started to be heard on the question of segregation in schools. One of the first was in Massachusetts, when the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were permissible under the state's constitution, and this was considered to be a seminal decision which was used later to support and justify the separate but equal doctrine which was in place for so long here in the United States. This was followed by the Dred Scott decision, which is infamous in the history of decisions about African Americans and the U.S. in the legal system, which denied citizenship to African Americans. And that itself didn't change until a year after the end of the Civil War, when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It took another year for the 14th Amendment to give equal protection under the law to African Americans, including citizenship. That said, segregation, of course, didn't go away. So in the late 1800s, the Supreme Court essentially authorized segregation by upholding Louisiana's separate but equal law as constitutional. And in that case, that law was specifically about African Americans in separate train cars. But it was used as an extension of the support for the idea that separate but equal was allowed in other areas such as education. And other cases which built on this allowed, for example, Georgia to levy taxes on both black and white families, but to only provide public schooling for white children. At the same time, though, social attitudes, especially in the North, were changing slowly, so that by 1940, 30% of Americans, but notice how many more of them were in the North than the South, believed that whites and blacks should attend the same schools. And then we started to see shifts in the legal landscape around segregation and schooling, such that for example, Mexican American and white student segregation was struck down by a federal appeals court in the mid-1940s. And this led the California governor at the time to repeal a California state law which called for the segregation of Native and Asian American students from white students. So the shift begins to move the education dial a little bit. In 1950, the Supreme Court rejected Texas's plan to create an entire new law school to avoid having black students attend a whites-only law school, and says, and I think this is an important quote to pay attention to, that learning in law school, and I think this is true, of course, for any school, cannot be effective in isolation from the individuals and institutions with which the law interacts. And educational success suggests that education in the K through 12 system is the same way, that being educated in isolation from certain kinds of citizens of the United States doesn't seem to benefit students. So the big seminal case in shifting from segregation to desegregation was Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which took 2 years to decide and overturned the earlier Plessy rule, declaring that separate schools are inherently unequal. And when they finally did decide on implementation, how are we going to desegregate schools, they insisted that lower federal courts require desegregation with all deliberate speed. And one of the big ways of doing that was busing. But before that, people reacted very, very strongly across the United States, and particularly in the South. So, for example, in Virginia, the governor actually ordered public schools closed in some places. And it took federal rulings to overturn that closure. Ruby Bridges, we've all seen the famous picture of her at 6 years old, requiring federal marshals to protect her as she went to school to desegregate her local schools. There were riots all over the place. But the social sentiment continued to shift towards desegregation, so that by 1963, well over half of Americans, again, the predominance of them in the North, believed that whites and blacks should attend the same schools. And when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was adopted, it included a provision for the federal government to file school desegregation cases, which provides higher level oversight over desegregation efforts. And it prohibited discrimination in programs and activities which include schools that receive federal funding. And in 1968, the Green versus County School Board identified 5 factors that could be used to gauge compliance in desegregation efforts, which allows people to actually examine and assess whether desegregation is taking place and whether it's being successful. So did it work? Well, by the 1970s, the South had become the nation's most integrated region, which is kind of interesting. So the North wasn't under a lot of these desegregation orders, and so it didn't see the full effects of the desegregation in quite the same way that the South had, such that by 1976, 45% of the South's African American students were in majority white schools. And you can look at the comparison. It's only about a quarter of African American students in the Northeast and the Midwest who have this happen. And as I mentioned before, these gains really came in no small part from busing, from actually moving students around within school districts to make sure that they were in desegregated schools. And that dislike of busing was something that came back as an argument against desegregation later. So by 1988, school integration had reached an all-time high, as you can see, with almost half of Black students in the U.S. attending majority white schools. And studies at that time showed that desegregation led to better educational outcomes, really for all students, but especially, of course, for minority students. But then the tide turned, so that a series of Supreme Court decisions began to blunt the effect of desegregation. So in 1974, the Milliken versus Bradley decision allowed the Supreme Court to block these large-scale desegregation plans, which was followed up in '86 by a decision of the Supreme Court saying that once a school district had met its desegregation obligations, it could be released from the desegregation plan. So as long as it got there once, then it could stop having to be assessed on an ongoing basis in terms of its desegregation efforts. And then in '91, there was a follow-on case which made it even easier for schools to meet their obligations and therefore be released from their desegregation plans. As a result of these, a decade later, Harvard's Civil Rights Project showed that U.S. schools were well on their way towards resegregation, such that by 2003, only a little over half of Black students graduated from high school on time with a regular diploma, compared to 78% of white students. And this is at the same time that resegregation is beginning again. And we'll see some statistics about that in just a second. It's important to note that nearly half of the nation's African American students as of 2004 attended high schools in which graduation was not the norm. And this is by comparison to just over 10% of white students. In 2002, 23% of all Black students who started public high school left it prepared for college, compared to 40% of white students. So we're seeing now the insidious effects of resegregation on minority students. And while we're focusing here on Black students because they've often been the focus of court cases, this is true for other low-income minority students as well. While desegregation is still in theory the law of the land, in practice that is no longer what we're seeing. And we're seeing that in particular, the resegregation of schools is leading to poor educational outcomes. So, for example, more than 60% of Black students attend schools where over half of the school population lives in poverty, compared to 18% of white students. And poverty has a tremendous depressive effect on school success for all kinds of reasons, which we'll explore as we go on. Even though U.S. schools are now 41% non-white, it's mostly non-white students who are experiencing segregation in schools. High schools, which are high poverty and have a majority of minority students, are more likely to have what we call weak promoting power, meaning that 50%, that is less than half of freshmen, get to senior status within 4 years. So this is a major drag on students' ability to move on and succeed. It's also interesting that of the 31 states who educate 6 out of every 10 minority students in America, those are the school districts where the highest minority enrollments get the fewest resources. It's also the case that those resources involve, for example, highly qualified teachers. So in high schools where at least 75% of the students are low income, there are far more uncertified teachers or teachers who are teaching outside of their field of certification than in schools with wealthier populations. And then finally, Black students, and this is true of other minorities as well, are far more likely than white students to attend schools where the school setting itself shows signs of neglect or degradation or lack of support from the states within which they exist in the form of trash, graffiti, and disrepair of the school. So as I said, this is just a high-level overview. Here are some of the citations that I used to pull these things together in case you're interested in examining or learning more about segregation in schools. And this is something, of course, that we'll be talking about as we read the Kozel book. So be thinking about any questions that you have or thoughts that you have about this or experiences that you've had either in desegregated schools or in highly segregated schools.